Welcome back to another episode of the Deep Cover Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Zaran. Thank you again for joining me for another week of sports discussion and conversation. This week, I want to focus a little bit on the NFL, and I want to start that with a little story quickly and a little bit of background. So, I have grown up a fan and a watcher of the New York Giants. And for nearly 20 years before moving to the Seattle area, I lived in Detroit. So a lot of the friends that I have on my social media pages are from Detroit. So keep that in mind. So I logged on to Instagram, Facebook, whatever, the other day and was just kind of scrolling through my feed. And I noticed all these people were just super excited about this Detroit Lions game that was coming up. And I was like, oh, I had no idea it was preseason already. So I looked it up, and sure enough, they were playing that night against the Giants. And I literally had no idea. You know, I watch the NFL every weekend when the regular season is here, but I really don't watch preseason. A friend of mine who lives in Scotland and is a fan of the Buffalo Bills, he was excited about preseason. And I told him, listen, man, I couldn't care less. And the reason for that is because the preseason has been rendered more and more useless and unnecessary in the NFL over the last 10 to 15 years. And my friend kind of pushed back on me. He's like, well, it's football, it's back, and, this is a great thing. And eventually he watched and realized that preseason has a bunch of backups and, players that you aren't likely to see when the games start to matter in a few weeks. So he's like, yeah, you were right. That was not the best use of my time. And it got me to thinking about the NFL preseason, but also the hook that football has on us societally. And what is the reasoning behind it? Why is it that we're just so desperate for any sort of NFL action? And so I kind of want to talk about that, right? So let's start with the point of the preseason. So years ago, the way the preseason kind of worked would be you would get live action reps for your starters. They would play the first quarter, sometimes the first two quarters if you really needed to see some game film, and then you bring in the backups in the second quarter or in the second half, depending on how you were running that as a coach. Then the league shifted to add another game and took one of the preseason games away. So now you have 3 preseason games and 17 regular season games. And what you're seeing more and more and more is the removal of any starters playing whatsoever in preseason. And the person who really started this was Rams head coach Sean McVay, when a few years ago he decided he's not playing any of his guys in the preseason. They was like, oh, they're going to be rusty coming out of the gate, so and so. And they went on to start that season 8-0. So that really dispelled the validity of that theory. So as a result now, if you're a high-level team that's going to be competing for the playoffs, you don't waste any opportunities for your starters or your entrenched players in preseason because, 1, you don't want to risk injury, and 2, you kind of know what you have already, so what's the point of seeing more quote-unquote live game reps? What the preseason does accomplish, I think, is 2 things. 1, the tickets are a lot cheaper, right? Recently, my partner and I were pricing out some Seahawks tickets here, and their preseason game against the Browns was tickets were $60 for really pretty good seats, whereas regular season tickets were at least double that, right? So for fans, it's a cheaper way, it's still expensive for a lot of families, to get to a game, watch some live action football, and have a good time. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is if you have some position battles going on in camp, and we saw this last year with the Hard Knocks preseason training camp with the Detroit Lions, where your third or fourth corner is having a position battle. You got somebody trying to make the team as a third running back. Guys on the fringes of starting for a team. They often have an opportunity to make themselves well known in the preseason. But in terms of a viewing product, it's not really good. The scoring's usually low. obviously the games don't matter, so the final score is irrelevant. You're really more looking for, this guy made a good throw, or that guy ran some good routes, or this guy had some good plays running the ball in the backfield. But, you're not going to put too much stock into what happens in a preseason game realistically in the grand scheme of things. But it made me realize that people just love football so much. It is by far and away the nation's favorite sport. It's the nation's favorite thing to watch on TV. It's just incredibly popular. And it reminded me of a friend of mine, a good friend of mine, who, we talk sports all the time. He's into other sports as well, but he really locks in for the NFL season. Is watching games all day on Sundays, never misses Monday night, never misses Thursday night, an active bettor on those games as well. And as soon as the Super Bowl ended, he kind of started having this thing on social media where he would count down the days until football was back. And I thought it was kind of funny because I was thinking, well, now you could pivot into the NBA, or now you could pivot into the NHL, or if you're into MLB or MLS or any of these other sports that happen during football's off season. And while he still watched those games, he would always have the tally, can't wait till football is back. And I think part of that is the need for fans to kind of have the sport they love. But another part of it is just the things that we associate with football, right? So, but let's talk about, and I think that kind of leads into why people actually care about preseason sometimes, right? Why they watch preseason, why they're excited for preseason, because they've gone through the whole summer and the spring before it, and in some cases, not really watching much sports. Like after March Madness and maybe the NBA playoffs, if they're into that, there's kind of a lull. Yeah, you have baseball, but baseball's popularity is diminishing, right? And football is one of those sports that has this rabid fan base, so those people are kind of cooped up, and haven't really had the chance to put that outward energy out, for their love of this game for a few months now. So even football that doesn't count, with players you're probably not going to remember or even know 90% of the time, they're going to sign up for that because they love football so much. But what do they love about it, right? I think I've always said that when you think about a movie like the movie Gladiator with Russell Crowe, directed by Ridley Scott, which obviously depicts the gladiator games during the Roman Empire, a lot of times we think of gladiator games, fight to the death or fighting against like lions and tigers or whatever, as barbaric, right? And it's like, I can't believe how they do that. We're so much more civilized now because we don't watch people fighting for their lives for sport. And I think while that's somewhat true, you also have to acknowledge that our love of football is somewhat rooted in the fact that we have a hunger, a thirst, a desire to watch controlled violence. Because you think about it, that's what football is. It's coordinated collisions 150 times a game, right? Between both offense and defense and whatever happens on special teams. And there's a gladiator-like persona that we often attach to the players that do well. Think of, the physical specimens that some of these guys are, right? And they are just like, they are our champions. And I think we kind of relate to them a little bit more than basketball players, because you can have guys of diminutive stature in football be excellent. You think about any running back, they're almost always under 6 feet tall. You think about, now granted, most of your excellent quarterbacks over the years have been 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", but there has been a precedent for shorter and smaller quarterbacks having success. Kyler Murray, Russell Wilson, these type of guys who have been able to have smaller sizes and still perform at a high level. You think about defensive backs are almost always like 5'9", 5'10", 5'11". And so that's a more attainable thing where you think, yeah, if I was really in good shape, I could be that guy, right? I could be Patrick Peterson. I could be Sauce Gardner, whoever the case may be, right? And in basketball, for example, you don't have that because to be great in basketball, you got to be closing in on 7 feet tall. It's just a genetic anomaly, right? So, like in basketball, you kind of have to have the genetics for it on top of the never ending skill. Football is a lot of want to, determination, work ethic, things that kind of resonate with people, right? So, the players become super likable from that perspective. A lot of these guys, as a result, have a little bit of humility to them, family rooted. A lot of guys who come from the South, so they have a background of faith and religion. So that kind of tends to play well with a lot of people across the country in terms of a relatability aspect. And so you have that element, right? And then you have the element of the reason why we love it so much is football's a really low commitment sport as a fan, if you really think about it. Now, you could be a degenerate like me or any of my other friends who, get Red Zone, Sunday Ticket, have multiple screens going on Sundays, watch a bunch of games. Or you could just be a fan of your team. And what does that require? You're only really committing 3 to 4 hours a week on Sundays typically, unless they have like a Monday or Thursday night game. And that's your time commitment for the week in your team. If you're a baseball fan, you're committing that same amount of time 5 or 6 times a week. If you're a basketball fan, you're committing that time 2 or 3 times a week. Same with hockey, sometimes 4 times a week. So there's a lower level of commitment that's required to be a dedicated football fan of a team, right? So that allows it to be more friendly for the casual viewer, and it allows it to be more digestible for that person because you could only watch one game on Sunday and be generally almost as informed as somebody who's reading all the news articles and listening to all the podcasts and doing all this stuff, right? And because of that, football has, I think, taken the stronghold in a way that other sports have kind of, not been able to grasp. We're in this society now that has so much information going on. There's shows you have to watch. There's movies you got to go see. There's articles you want to read, podcasts you want to listen to. Everybody's throwing content at us in one which way or another, right? The sports leagues are no different than that. So they kind of want us to be able to really invest in their product. And quite frankly, not everybody is cut out to watch 3 or 4 basketball or hockey games a week or 5 baseball games a week. But ask somebody to donate or to give you 3 to 4 hours of your time on a Sunday to watch a football game, they're okay with that, right? Because football is just, it has the activity level, the athleticism, the great plays, the physicality that we just seem to gravitate towards, and it doesn't have too much of a time suck, so it's kind of perfect for the modern day individual, right? And I think that is part of what contributes to it. Another element, though, is for a lot of people, football signifies fall, right? It's the end of the summer, and a lot of people, they love fall, right? They love it for, Halloween's coming up, the holidays come up after that. Stuff like seasonal drinks and things you eat, like pumpkin and apple related things, those type of things resonate. And all of those, and football is kind of associated in that fall activity vacuum, right? And it has this kind of allure that is season specific. Even though football tends to go from the fall into the winter, it's always considered kind of like a fall sport, right? And baseball, in a way, is considered a summer sport. Basketball isn't really considered a seasonal sport at all, neither is hockey. But because people love the fall so much, and they think about the holidays and everything like that, like Thanksgiving, the NFL has monopolized Thanksgiving, right? Because you just like family, food, football, right? It's a built-in marketing slogan waiting to happen. And that is just kind of the marketing and brand cachet that the sport of football and the NFL as a whole has really kind of domineered and implemented and really made as part of the American lexicon. It's become this slice of Americana that we really can't explain. And to that point, I think why a lot of people have a little bit of trouble locking into basketball and baseball is the foreign element. I've written about this before, about the xenophobic element when it comes to us watching sports, where I think a lot of Americans, whether they like to admit it or not, like the fact that 99% of the great NFL players out there are American, right? They're born in the U.S., they live in the U.S., the English is their first and primary language. You look at the NBA, more and more foreign-born players. Baseball has become dominated by Latin America and East Asia, specifically Japan, the Dominican Republic, those type of countries. And I think there's maybe a little bit of a loss of relatability that some fans feel. And you don't have that in football because they're all like us, right? They're all American. And you can feel whatever way you want about that. I think it speaks to the broader sociological viewpoint of a lot of Americans for that reason. But when you combine all those things, the seasonal stuff with the controlled violence and the athleticism, the relatability of the athletes, and the fact that they are mostly American, it's a sport that we as Americans now dominate, I think that a lot of people just end up gravitating towards football. So when it comes to the preseason, they see, hey, I don't care, it's football. Let me sign me up, and I am ready to watch some Detroit Lions or New York Giants or Seattle Seahawks or LA Chargers, whatever, because that's my team, and this is the sport I love, and I'm going to watch it. And again, with the preseason, if you're only really watching one team, it's, again, one game a week. Even if the players, you don't really know them or the games don't matter, it's irrelevant because it's football on TV, and it reminds you of the fall, it reminds you of the holidays, it reminds you of all this kind of warm and fuzzy stuff, especially as you're getting out of a really hot summer. But I want to kind of close on some more preseason stuff here. There have been players who have advocated for a long time that preseason doesn't make sense, that you should really get rid of the preseason. The issue for that becomes that a team owner is not going to let that go because you're taking away 1 to 2 home games and ticket sale opportunities from them by getting rid of the preseason. The only acceptable alternative path to that, and I think a couple of guys have mentioned this, former players, is to eliminate all 3 preseason games, because it used to be 4, it's now 3, and add another regular season game, so 18 games. But because of the wear and tear fears, right, add a second bye week. So there's good and bad thoughts about that, right? The addition of the 17-game season as opposed to the 16-game season, and even before that, the 14-game season. Every time they add more games, there's going to be more injuries. It's just a law of averages. It's going to happen. Football's a violent game. Injuries happen all the time on every Sunday. It's a part of the game. We understand that. If you add another game, you're going to get more injuries. Now, that, again, opens up the opportunity to have additional roster spots, so more guys get an opportunity. And now with the emergence of the UFL and its media sponsorship deals, a lot of those guys could be plucked from the UFL. We've seen that this offseason. A lot of teams signing guys who excelled in that league. And adding the second bye week kind of really allows a little bit of a resting period for a lot of these guys. And so I think from a player safety perspective, it's less games played overall. You have more roster spots. The money is still there. And you look at, I don't think that there's enough spoken to that. You don't really get that much value from tape you get on a preseason game. Like, yeah, these guys are running 3/4 speed. And the guys are, if you're looking at, like, for example, Atlanta had Michael Penix in against the Dolphins during their preseason game. And he made a couple really nice throws and shows you why he was a first-round quarterback coming out of Washington. But at the same time, the Dolphins aren't playing their top guys. They're also probably not trying to give away too much in the terms of what kind of defensive alignments they're running. So if you're the Dolphins and you're thinking about incorporating some exotic blitz packages to confuse opposing quarterbacks this season, why on earth would you show that off in the preseason? Conversely, offenses aren't going to, show their multitude of stuff. They're probably going to stay in their base packages, the stuff that they're going to run multiple times on Sundays, that everybody knows they're going to run. So it's not going to be overly complex. So from seeing what you have in a player thing, I don't think it's all that much more beneficial to have them in preseason as opposed to your practice stuff. In addition, your joint practices that a lot of teams have, right? That allows you more of an opportunity to really run some different stuff that you could really see where a player is progressing and not progressing. So, and a lot of people say, well, what about the rust factor? Obviously, the McVay thing kind of dispelled that, as we talked about earlier. But I really don't think it's that big of a deal, right? Like, these guys are training throughout training camp, getting ready. They're professionals. They should be ready when called upon. And I kind of compare it to college football, which has increasingly become more and more sort of like professional football. They don't have a preseason. Now, granted, some schools might schedule, inferior opponents or whatever, but, they don't have a preseason. So I don't really think the NFL absolutely needs a preseason. As much as it is unfortunate for fans that ticket prices are out of whack and that preseason might be the only affordable way. But to that end, I kind of think that, on TV is probably a little bit of a better product than live. Now, the great thing about going live, especially if you're going to the right stadium, is that you can't really create that atmosphere on TV. But I think that's one concession to the fact that we're playing these preseason games and they're kind of useless. I think the big blowback is going to be that fans are going to have to wait longer for their teams to start playing. So you would imagine if this 18-game season with no preseason came into play, you would probably push back the start by a week or two to be able to account for the bye week and account for the extra time, and so that your Super Bowl is still right around the beginning of February. So I think when you kind of look at the preseason and it kind of is a statement on Americans' fascination with the game of football, which I've always found super interesting. The way we love the NFL, the way we love combat sports like UFC and boxing over the years, I think really says a lot about us as a society. And also, again, the investment aspect, right? That you don't have to be locked in every single day. You could, just dedicate it as a thing you do on the weekend. So I think the preseason kind of speaks to us a lot and tells us a lot about our fascination with football. And the NFL season is starting up pretty soon here, so I'm pretty excited about it to see what becomes of it. There's a lot of storylines, obviously, kind of like the return of Aaron Rodgers and Jim Harbaugh coming back to the NFL, Caleb Williams, an exciting draft pick. How's that going to shake out in Chicago? A lot of really interesting stuff. We'll be covering it all, of course, on the Deep Cover Sports Podcast. You could follow me, my link tree below in the show notes, and you will see my social media stuff, my Medium articles, Off the Ball Network articles as well. So make sure to follow all of that. But until next time, I'm Omar Zaran, Deep Cover Podcast. See you next week.